If you want a build that is not only fun, has excellent movement, deals high DPS, and lets you take out anyone you can think of, whether it's trash mobs, elites, bosses, or even other players in the fields of hatred, this build might be for you. We're going to go over how to set this up for Worlds Tiers 3 and 4. This build relies on a few things. Number 1, Poison Imbuement, because without that we can't get that high DPS and that damage over time with Twisted Blades. Number 2, we have Dash to be able to get out of sticky situations. Number 3, Shadow Step, anti-crowd control when someone stuns you, and it allows you to kind of just do that full reset. Shadow Clone. Not only do we get a body double that lets us deal high damage to the targets around us, it also grants anti-crowd control for, I believe, anywhere from 4 to 6 seconds. From here, we're going to dive a little bit into a few things. Our gear first, then we're going to go over the aspects and related skills, deep dive into the skills, and we're going to go over the Paragon nodes as well to show how all of this works together and creates a system that you can really enjoy. From the top, with this helmet, we're looking to increase maximum life, but also drive additional dexterity. When we get hit, when we're not healthy, we get a bubble that allows us to be immune, to give us a little breathing room against bosses and elites. Next up, for our armor, we've imprinted a defensive skill here, where we get a barrier if, we damage an elite enemy, which gives us a little bit more of a health buffer, lets us stay in the mix a little longer. The Warlord Plate of the Protector gives us plus 9% cutthroat skill damage, and it also reduces the amount of time we are control impaired. Now our gloves. The imprint here is that when we get injured, while we're crowd controlled, we become unstoppable. So that layers on with Shadow Step and with Shadow Clone in the sense that we can escape very, very sticky situations where people lock us down. With these gauntlets, we have 2 ranks of Twisting Blades, and something else I like a lot is the increased attack speed. We also rely on these pants for getting us life generation while we're not in fights, and allows us to take less damage from distant enemies. Imprinted here as well is Victimize. About 1 out of every 3 or 4 hits leads to an explosion, which affects not only the enemy, but the people around, hence Victimize. These explosions not only hurt the people around the enemies, but also allow us to heal. One thing that we really want to talk about here on these legendary boots is the ability to gain movement speed when we evade. That's something I always look for when I'm looking at my boots, because it helps us move faster and get to the enemies that we want. And for this crossbow, the guaranteed vulnerable damage that we see at the top, but other things we're looking for here as well to supplement the high damage per second of this build is the core skill damage, damage over time, damage to crowd controlled enemies, and finally the ultimate, which benefits the Shadow Clone that we use once in a while. We got our amulet here, which gives us an additional charge of Shadow Step, gives us 1 more attempt to get out of crowd control. Having this imbuement, not only does it create additional damage to enemies when we're in the poison pool ourselves, our skill has no cooldown. On top of that, with the rings, I typically look for the usual, which is more vulnerable damage, more physical damage, and more critical strike chance. Our second ring, the Ravenous Loop, is that when we kill a vulnerable enemy, we get 66% increased energy regeneration, which is great because this build uses a lot of energy because we spam Twisted Blades. The 23% additional damage on dazed enemies is also really useful because it allows us to clear high level enemies faster, and the additional imbued skill damage is pretty key. We have imprinted here on our dagger the ability to have our Shadow Clones mimic the imbuements that we have, so it's great way to deal additional imbuement damage. Condemnation is a unique dagger that allows us to maximize our combo point specialization. It increases the odds, number 1, of us hitting full combo points without having to land those 3 specific shots. We can get it in 1 or 2. And our core skills here, namely Twisted Blades, also gets increased damage when we do hit those combo points. Specialization here, obviously, combo points, because combo points lets us maximize the use of our core skills. Alright, now that we got our gear out of the way, let's move on to the fun stuff. So we use combo points. Our attack flow is going to go as follows. We start off with Puncture. Puncture is extremely crucial because without it, we can't set vulnerable damage. Our combo is going to be Puncture, 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 Twisted Blades, and the Shadow Clone. I forgot to say that you gotta pop the Poison Imbue first. Our specialization is combo points. With combo points, we use our basic skill, which is Puncture, number 1 to set up vulnerability, but as soon as we land 3 puncture shots, it lights up the bar for combo points, which means that Twisted Blades lands a lot more damage. That being our core skill, we definitely want to run Poison Imbue so that we maximize the benefit all across the board. Go to our skill tree. So we start off with Puncture, because that's our basic skill. That's our marksman skill. We do Enhanced Puncture. We want to gain energy when we damage a crowd control enemy. We use Fundamental Puncture, which throws 3 blades in a spread, which deals more base damage. And again, if you hit anyone with 2 blades at once, it makes them vulnerable. This is the key part of Fundamental Puncture. From there, we move on to our core skills. And in core skills, we got Twisted Blades. I got 5 base points in Twisted Blades. You'll see 7 here because of some of our gear. From Twisted Blades, we move on to Enhanced Twisting Blades, which means additional damage when it returns. And finally, with Improved Twisting Blades, we're able to apply Dazed on enemies, which makes it harder for them to cast their skills. Remember for the next part that Improved Twisting Blades helps us daze other enemies, which complements Dash really well. Stutter Step. When we critical strike somebody, we get additional movement speed. I love having a really fast rogue that moves around the map quickly, so if you want more, put more into this. Now we move on to our agility skills. We're quite generous in our allocation of points here. I would say this is the bread and butter of the build, in addition to poison. Shadow Step, I use it to become unstoppable. When somebody slows me in a nightmare dungeon, Shadow Step is my way out. And because we have gear that complement Shadow Step, we have 2 casts of this, so that's 2 ways to get out of being caught in a spider web or something along those lines. It's also a cutthroat skill. Enhanced Shadow Step allows us to increase our crit chance. Methodical Shadow Step stuns enemies and messing up their movement, pretty fundamental to this build. Dash slows enemies and they take additional crit damage. Dash helps us get from one side of the screen to the other. The beauty of Dash is that if you run Poison Imbue right before you cast it, you can poison a whole line of enemies and watch their health bars drop because of damage over time. We move on to the essentials of Dash. Enhanced Dash to increase critical strike damage. Our build again relies on landing a lot of hits on people. Discipline Dash. Dash slows enemies. Discipline Dash helps us turn slowed enemies into dazed enemies. We can also use Twisting Blades to daze them a second time. That'll be important in a second. Rapid Gambits reduces our evade cooldown. Trick attacks, when we combine the daze from Dash and the daze from Twisting Blades, it ensures that when we're dealing with crowds and trash mobs, that for the most part, everyone is dazed. If we take the fact that we are landing a lot of shots on a lot of people, at some point we're going to critically strike someone, especially if they're an elite or another player. If we knock them down for a second and a half, that's pretty crucial for giving us some breathing room and to allow us to essentially just clear the map. Use Exploit helps us deal increased damage to enemies. Here we got it at the full amount, so we deal 18%. And Malice, more damage to vulnerable enemies, which compounds with Puncture and Twisting Blades. We go all out on Poison. We're going to go into each of these items. Poison Imbuement regular with 5. Enhanced Poison Imbuement, which makes poison last longer by 1 second. Mixed Poison Imbuement, it gives us a 30% chance of applying double the poisoning damage over time. We use Deadly Venom to deal additional poisoning damage on top of that. And then we put 3 into Debilitating Toxins. Poisoned enemies deal less damage, and when poisoned enemies deal less damage, that allows us to stay in close range, landing Twisting Blades for a longer duration of time before we have to get out and reposition. So with ultimates, we have Shadow Clone. Mimics our actions, deal 80% of our damage. The reason we use Shadow Clone and not Death Trap is when we cast Shadow Clone, it allows us to become unstoppable, which is really key, again, to getting out of sticky situations. Prime Shadow Clone, that's how we get that benefit that we just talked about. And finally, Supreme Shadow Clone deals another 20% of damage. So all that adds up to 80%, I believe. There's also available imprints and legendary aspects that can essentially allow your Shadow Clone to also land imbuement damage. We also use Adrenaline Rush, more movement, more energy regeneration with Adrenaline Rush. Haste, it's a way to get increased movement speed or attack speed depending on how much energy we have. And our key passive is going to be Victimize. I like to pair Victimize with gear that gets you health back from hitting with Victimize. So with Victimize, if you deal direct damage to a vulnerable enemy, it has a 30% chance to cause an explosion, which not only hurts the enemy specifically, but the enemies around them too. Think of it like Shadow Imbue, but at a smaller scale. But again, because of our gear, when we land Victimize, we get some health back, which again allows us to stay in close distance for a little longer. And our Paragon board, we try to aim to get as much dexterity as possible, increase as much vulnerable damage as possible as well, crit damage and damage to elites, and taking less damage from elites. For the most part, if a player is blood marked, the benefits for countering elites lets us counter blood marked players better as well. Our Glyph Socket allows us to get more damage for additional dexterity purchased. We go to the next board. And by the way, if you're having trouble opening the next board, leave a comment. It's kind of a pain. Eldritch Bounty, legendary node, really important. When we attack with an imbued skill, we get additional resistance, but more importantly, 20% increased damage for 6 seconds. And we progress onto Imbuer, additional damage. It's a rare node. We move left to another board, more dexterity, more strength, mainly dexterity. Next glyph socket, called Closer or Closer. This glyph creates more cutthroat damage. Cutthroat damage aligns with Twisting Blades. The more dexterity points that you get on this Paragon board, the more cutthroat damage you get, which is great. We move again, and we go to Focused. More cutthroat skill damage, more damage against elites. Lawless, cutthroat skill damage, again, and armor and dexterity. And Tricks of the Trade as well. Marksman skills grant additional damage for cutthroat skills, vice versa. If you liked what you watched and you learned a thing or two from this video, please feel free to like and subscribe. I'd love to hear more about your experience running Rogue and what your build is, some pros and cons, and even some feedback for this build. So until the next one, have a good one, and I'll see you out in the fields of hatred, perhaps.